between all of the news stories of developments and growth and the excitement behind AI, we don't really realize, or maybe there's not enough discourse about the power that corporations and our bosses have over our futures. Like, it's not AI that's replacing us. It's people that are replacing other people with this promise of what they think AI can do. Welcome to Everyday Data. This is the show where we examine all things data, analytics, and AI that are trending in the news today. We're your hosts, Patricia and Zac. We're MSB AI graduates from NYU's Stern School of Business, and we're data and pop culture enthusiasts. And we love to talk about all things data on this show, so let's get into it. This week is book club. We love book club over here. And for this month's book club, we read The Reverse Centaurs Guide to Life After AI by Doctorow. And boy, do we have a lot of thoughts. And we are excited to share them all with you. But first, as always, what's in the news that's been catching our eyes? Zac, why don't you go first and share something that's been catching your eyes in the news lately?
Sure. Okay. And welcome back, Patricia. So we have old news and new news because Patricia's been on vacation. So I've been wanting to share and talk about one, but there's a second follow-up piece that came out Monday, 2 days ago. So while you're on vacation, the Chinese company they released the model called Kimi K3. It's an open source AI large language model. It was, generated a ton of buzz. This was about 2 weeks ago, I think, right when you were going on vacation. And so I was reading a bunch of course, analysis of, how do you run it? It's still so big that you can't run it on your personal PC, but it ignited a big debate, of course, about being an open weight model, which some of the other LLMs like DeepSeek are. So the fact that the Chinese kind of approach to AI is these open models, and then the US approach was, of course, our closed paid models like the OpenAI models, ChatGPT, you have Anthropic's Claude. So it ignited a big debate about, China versus US and their approach to AI and these large language models. But the news from this week that ties into this is that Meta, again, one of the big players in AI, and because they've got so many resources, they just released their own open weight model. So Monday, Mark Zuckerberg announced that the release of the Meta Muse Spark, which is a open weight version of their model that they were developed. So they're going to develop their closed, paid model. And now they also released this Muse Spark model, which is an open weights. And then even though I've read a bunch of stories, but just for any listeners, the difference between open weight and open source in software, open source software is software that's free to download and the source code is available. So anyone can basically edit it and work on the software. So an example would be Windows is a paid operating system, but then you have free Linux distributions, which are anyone can work on, but of course you don't have the support. Similar to AI models, this is not open source, so you can't actually see how it's built, but it's open weight, which the weights are the training data. So it's trainable for free, but not the secret sauce of how they built it. I don't know if there's a cookie analogy. It's you get a recipe and you can change the ingredients, but you don't know the steps to how you cooked it. So the secret of the building is still this Meta model and the Chinese model. They're both closed source. So they're still private how it's actually put together. But what it does, and the kind of the discussion we'll throw back to you for your thoughts, Patricia, is, how does this change the landscape? My opinion is that it's more competition. It's a good thing. I think that was what I was reading about the big discussion 2 weeks ago, and now it's going to be amplified about the approach of China versus US and how, is basically giving away part of the model and making, putting it in the hands of users at a lower cost. Is that good for a country? And Zuckerberg's, he had this whole big, a 14-page announcement with it. His whole philosophy of doing this was that exactly. He wanted to ensure that US kind of dominance in the AI market, because the American models, these closed Anthropic frontier models, OpenAI, are ahead of the Chinese models, whereas the Chinese approach is kind of putting it out there and letting capitalism do its thing and letting the users figure out cool new ways to do things versus investing billions of dollars into, AI research.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's like it always feels like we're in a race, right? Like innovation race, creativity race, make things cheaper race. And so it just feels like the next step in that. So for me, it feels like such a natural evolution. I can't believe I was really on vacation. Like I was really plugged out because I had no clue this happened. And I think that's really fascinating. Um, and I think the other great part of this news is I always think access is better. Like it just feels like it's opening up access to
Yeah.
regular people. And that's always something that's really important because it allows like people who maybe don't always engage with AI or like those people that think that AI is this black box to engage in a new way. And so I'm interested to see feedback. Like, I don't know if you've seen any feedback from anyone who's like, has this already launched? I can't remember if you said that it's already launched.
Yeah, the Kimi K3 model launched, but it's one of those things where it's like it's available, but the model's still so big. There's still so many parameters. It's not like this model that you could run on your consumer MacBook at the moment. You still need like a massive data center to power the model. It's still so big, but tied but to similar to what we're going to be talking about with the book club, I think it does, as you mentioned, it paves the way for just opening up access, letting people tinker with it. Yes, at the moment, you need a lot of horsepower still, but there's that law of, kind of not really Moore's law anymore. I don't think the doubling of compute power, but there's these other techniques to take these big models and distill them, not distillation, that's training, but like to parameterize them and make them smaller so they can run on devices and use them to make other models. So I think it does have, now that you have this open source model, like you technically can't like use OpenAI's model to train your model, but since you have this open source model, you can use the distillation technique where one model trains another, and you can take this cheaper to run model and run it this way. And the other thing I've seen is, of course, these models are never as good, but that's the thing where it also, on one of these like technology innovation laws that we're talking about, just because it's not as good, it's still like miles ahead of what we had like 2-3 years ago. I know like our bar is up here for like these, high ranking benchmark models, but you can still do a lot, that we couldn't do before on these lower models. So, and at a lower cost, like you mentioned, and the accessibility, like the equality for like developing nations. Cause right now, yes, like there's no like a third world country. I mean, just stereotypically here, like in Africa, they're not building data centers to run OpenAI models. But if you had these low cost models, that would give, lower income nations access to similar levels of tools. And yeah, I think it is a good leveler for equality.
Yeah, and please fact check us. Like, if there are countries in Africa that are building data centers, then like hold us accountable to that. But I think another piece of it too, and we've talked about this in the past, is like we're still so early in the AI race, and people don't always realize that because the future of AI, we've talked about it like the cloud, right? Like we anticipate that the future of AI is that it will just be another tool that is used on our personal computers and our personal devices, and it kind of like is technology that eventually will like embed its way into the way that we live our daily lives. And this kind of feels like a way to like another step to getting there.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to see how it changes. Like I need to read more about it. Obviously, I'm hearing about it from the first time from you, and so these are just like my initial thoughts, and they're a bit half baked. But
But on that note, so let's hold those thoughts. Let's get to your news because our book does tie into these concepts. So before we get too far into that, what news do you have, Patricia?
I have very quick news, so we can get right into our discussion. But a little bit of a funny story is that, there's, as everyone knows, I'm from Canada. Okay, and there was an MLA from New Brunswick who, during his address to the New Brunswick legislature, as he was reading his address, it was written by AI. And so in the flow of reading, he just read the AI prompt during his address, and it's sparked a lot of interesting conversation on the internet about using AI. And I think he did a pretty good job of being like, listen, everyone's using AI. So am I. These are still my ideas, but I needed help with rewriting them, which, you know what, is fair enough. But I just think that what a funny moment to be out here, and it's sad because, I don't know what he was trying to say. And I don't think anyone cares now because everyone's just like, haha, he used AI and we all know about it now. And so that's my news for this week. I don't know if
Yeah.
you have any thoughts about that, Zach.
Well, I just want to touch on one thing you said, and this is one thing that my wife and I were debating, what you mentioned about authorship. And I think that's really interesting. We could probably talk a whole episode about that is when is it your thought and when does it become AI's thought? Because we had this discussion, my wife and I, who's an academic professor, we were talking about, I think, revising papers. So if you think of but you can use this analogy for writing a book, writing a speech. In the old times, pre-AI, this is like now where you have to use the olden times, pre-AI. If you, for this example, for this lawmaker, right, he would maybe write his thoughts and have like a intern or a scriptwriter, right, like polish the speech. But there was no question back then that it wasn't his speech. But the current debate is if you have AI do basically the same task as like a scriptwriter or a copywriter. So in our discussion with my wife, we were talking about like paper authorship, where in the olden times pre-AI, they would you'd have an editor, right? Like you'd have someone that would give you feedback. They might change a few sentences, but it was never a question that the work that was produced wasn't owned by the originator of the ideas, right? That it was revised and edited, like maybe by a team, not like a full ghostwriter, like ghostwritten books, but in the same speech with like the speech that he was giving. We don't know. Obviously, we're assuming here that he's probably fed it through AI. He didn't have him write the whole speech, but yeah, he had his talking points. And I do this. I'm sure you do this. You just ask it to, touch up my writing like a intern might do. But now we're suddenly jumping on him and saying it's AI written when it was more like copywriter. So it's a gray area. What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree with that. And I think and I actually think it's a great segue into talking about the book because there's this idea, right? Like, where does that relationship start and end for a lot of people where we're using AI as a tool to support and augment, but, because there are some folks who just use AI to write everything for them. Now, I think we've given everybody the default verdict of, well, if you have a little bit of AI, your entire thing is AI. Or none of your thoughts are your own. And so I think in the court of public opinion, it's really hard to stand up and be honest about your AI usage without people making assumptions about you. So we could literally have a whole other conversation about this, but let's get into our book for today. And if anyone has any thoughts, we'd love to hear your thoughts too on this topic.
Yeah, so talk about the book. So the book is a fairly recent book. It just came out in June 2026. As the title said, is The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI, How to Think About Artificial Intelligence Before It's Too Late. So was tuned to this by many reasons. I just generally read a lot of books, always browsing Goodreads, the technology section. I recently read another book by Doctorow, though, called Enshittification, which was his sort of thesis on how everything's getting worse and how everything is turning into like a paid service. Using like the stereotypical example of like software, you used to be able to just pay $100 and you owned it forever, but now you subscribe to just software. You don't own anything. Same for movies. You can only rent a movie. You can never buy it anymore because it's all digital. It's all streaming. You never actually own the object. Like Amazon can take the books out of your Kindle anytime. So his whole book, very interesting. And just some background, Doctorow works for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is sort of like a digital rights, like lobbying, advocacy group. So his like day job is to talk about things like how tech is getting worse. And this book, it just struck my eye because it sounds super interesting. And the idea of centaurs, so I'm going to use my prop here if you're watching the video, way back, again, talking about the before times, way back in 2024, when ChatGPT was still fairly new it had just come out, 2024. This book is called Co-Intelligence, Living and Working with AI by Ethan Mollick. And Ethan Mollick is a professor of business at Wharton Business School. So similar to Patricia and I went to NYU Stern, the business school. So he comes at technology with a business mindset. So I do really enjoy Ethan Mollick's writing and his work. I follow him on LinkedIn. He always has very insightful like updates about the implications and the research into technology. But his book brings up the concept of cyborgs and centaurs. And Doctorow here is sort of rehashing the idea a little bit. So what the title refers to is a centaur, where if you think of a traditional mythology, what a centaur is, it's a horse on the bottom and a human on the top. So in that analogy of with technology, we're the human on top. So we still have our brain. We have all this autonomy of being a human, but we're, instead of legs, we get all the benefits of being a horse. So we can run super fast. So it's like the best of both worlds. And this book, the thesis of the book in broad strokes, is a cautionary tale about us not to turn into reverse centaurs. So it's the reverse, where the human is on the bottom. So if we use the brain analogy, the horse is on top, or in this case, the AI. So the machine is doing the thinking and we're doing the running. So it's sort of more of a cautionary tale, maybe similar to his book Enshittification, where it's like a sort of a bit of a doom and gloom book. But I think we differ on this. I still found it very insightful, not for anything I didn't know, but it distills some of these concepts of, like the dangers of AI. Like I know we're sometimes like drawn to the hype, like, oh, it's so cool, I can code so much faster now. But there are sort of real implications to all aspects of life. And he uses some examples of the centaur example. And I'll give one example, then pass it to Patricia. And I think it's the strongest one for me in the centaur analogy was Amazon warehouses. When he talks about, yes, we get stuff super fast. This is also maybe sort of enshittification. But now, instead of the human being the role, what humans do in the Amazon warehouses, they pack the stuff that the robots pull off the shelves. So it is that kind of reverse centaur where the machines, the robots, the AI are doing the majority of the warehousing, the picking of items, and humans are just filling in these last mile gaps that AI hasn't figured out yet. I'm sure Amazon is trying to, but there are still, of course, some tasks that AI can't do. So this is the reverse centaur where, like we were talking about in this copywriting thing, I think is a centaur analogy where we come up with the ideas and then we're using AI as a tool to refine that. So the brain's still in charge. And the reverse centaur is like an Amazon warehouse where the machines are doing 90% of the labor and then the humans are just doing that last mile, put it in the bag sort of thing. So Patricia, I'm passing to you after this long intro of your just like initial thoughts on the title and the main thesis for the book.
Yeah, so I think you did a great job of kind of explaining that centaur versus reverse centaur. And I did think that his example for that was really good. I know that Zac and I have slightly differing views on the book, but just to give like a general overview of my thoughts, I think my big thing is I think he actually had great ideas in this book. And obviously, we're going to go through some of the ideas that really stood out to us. And after reflecting on it and looking back at my notes, which were really disjointed, I think like I did agree with a lot of the ideas, but I feel like the reason my notes were so disjointed because it felt like his thought process through the book was so chaotic. Like we were reading and then it felt like we were off on some random tangent. I kind of forgot what the chapter was about and why we're going through these like examples that are taking so long. And then towards the end, he kind of brings it back to the main point again, but then goes off and again on another tangent. And so I think one of my biggest criticisms while reading the book is actually not with the ideas. It's just with like the way that the book is written itself. And at this point, you and I have read so many like data analytics AI related books and like is just a lot. Like I really like when a book, especially when a nonfiction book is like really well laid out and really well thought out and is very chronological, has like a clear, like not only like his thesis was pretty clear, but the layout of the book for me was just like mind map. Like it just felt like going through his mind map, and that was kind of my issue with it because at the end of the day, like he did bring out some good topics, but I felt like they were just like lost in the rubble. And this is the thing with me, you can give me the most complex magical system that exists in fantasy, and I will totally follow along. But when it comes to nonfiction books, like I really do need to have it just kind of laid out simply for me. I love lists. I love like chapters that kind of go through a very linear thought process. And for me, that's kind of missing here. And there are certain moments where he kind of just like seems like, that trope of like an old man on his porch yelling at like the youth to get away from his flowers because like the youth of today are ruining the world. Like that's just like the energy he gives off in the book. And I feel like that takes away from the really good points that he makes. So that's kind of like all I'll say about my issues with his writing style. But I do think that he made some good points in the actual book itself. Like you brought up the centaur versus reverse centaur thing. I really like how he brought up the idea of like AI as a labor and power issue. Like he has some really great like gold nuggets that for me, like I just had to like, there was one chapter where I think I read it, listened to it, and then read and listened to it at the same time. So I was just like, what is the point of this? It was the chapter with all the copyright stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so this is, I know we talk all about books offline on this podcast a lot. So I think, yes, I understand your point. So to me, I think it resonated well because I liked, maybe I followed like, yeah, his like scatterbrain style. It felt modern. So I think this book, like, okay, if you ask like, who's it for? Okay, not to be stereotypical, but I think it's aimed at like the male demographic who might be, like not a serious reader. So it's someone who like not your style. People want the sequential, like more technical book, but I think it read very light, right? It was a very like, but not superficial because it still had great ideas. But it was
Yeah.
he used all these analogies. It's very like like I think it's set for the like ADHD. Someone type who just wants to, get the ideas and get in there. So he's writing for a specific audience. Maybe you would like my other book I mentioned, Ethan Malik, Co-Intelligence, which has a similar working with AI. So it's another more methodical manifesto on that. But comparing that to Co-Intelligence, I do think this book is, like it's important to get the idea out there. And these kind of books like that, where it sort of tempers, maybe you change someone's opinion, right? That was all in on AI and maybe they're just curious about, another differing opinion. This gives, yes, a bit of a doom and gloom. I did get that energy of,
Yeah.
old man yelling at cloud. He's very much not an optimist. And he mentioned it himself being a writer and how writing is very kind of like under siege by AI because AI can do so much these jobs. But then at the end, he circles back to some positives, right? That it is like a negative point, but he goes into how, life after the bubble, he talks about being a bubble. So I think it's a very timely book at this point to read it now before the bubble pops, even though we never know if it's ever going to pop. He's obviously predicting that eventually will, that all things, you can't just keep going unlimited growth forever. It has to eventually come down. But I think it's timely to read. So if you're on the fence, I think it's good to read it sooner rather than later.
I agree with that. Like I do think that it's a good book to read if you're kind of on the fence trying to understand what life looks like with AI. I think based on the title, you don't really understand what the book is going to be about. Like the life after AI, but he kind of only talks about that for one chapter at the very end. And so I actually really liked the end of the book. Like I feel like that's finally when things started to make sense to me. And I was like, okay, like I'm actually starting to understand what your predictions are and where you think AI is going to go. I almost wish that this was like a series of articles because I think that that would have read a lot better. I don't know. I don't know how the book is doing in the market. Like, he's a really popular author, obviously, and so I'm sure it's doing really well. But I actually really feel like this would have been a great series of articles because there's like certain themes that come up that are so interesting. But again, because so much of it got lost for me, it got lost. And then also some of his examples were just kind of dated. Like when he was writing this, it was probably over the point of like, he does reference 2025. So obviously like part of it is written over 2025. I don't know if any part of it is written in 2024, but some of his like limitations with AI, some of his examples just felt a little dated, like with the issues with AI, because some of those issues I felt have been fixed. like, the hallucinations of AI, like AI never really being able to fix your problems fully. Like that is a theme that came up a lot as well, in that like AI can do your job, it's never going to do your job as well. Except like there actually has been a lot of innovation and a lot of growth and development in AI, that there are some jobs and some roles that yeah, it actually is doing really well. And so I don't necessarily know that there was an opportunity to even acknowledge that, because I think when he was writing the book, it felt kind of outdated. So some of those examples for me didn't really hit. So that was like another, maybe one of my criticisms on the book. I swear I do have good points and I will get to them eventually. But that was just another point that I had to make.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can understand that criticism as well. That, yeah, that's what the book, I think, it balances that. Where is it going to be like evergreen? Is it always going to be relevant, or is it? Yeah, and I think it maybe one of the the struggles just to defend as a counterpoint to this is there's just so many books on AI out right now that you kind of have to take a stance, right? And like, okay, what's gonna make my book different from like the dozen or other AI books out right now? And as I said, I think he's going for the more younger, maybe male demographic of just they're in tech or tech curious, don't want to really engage the text in the text too much. They want to just get the information, get out. But yeah, like going with specific examples when they're solved, yeah, it's hard to say because yeah, technology changed so fast. And that's what I liked, again, always to bring up co-intelligence, that he wrote it more generic with the idea of the centaur, right? So Ethan Mollick describes like the concepts, more AI as a concept, like he calls it the term of the jagged frontier. So it's like a jagged edge that some tasks are really good with AI, some are not so much, but he doesn't like nail one specific thing like, oh, it can never do this. It's that some things are better for others. And we as users have to kind of navigate that, is like where is it appropriate to use AI because it's really good in one area, and where does it, not so appropriate. So approach it more from a like a general, like, okay, think about the task at hand. Can AI help me here? Or, do I need more human input on this? But on a positive note, so what did you actually like about this? We got to get back to the positives.
Okay, so a couple things that I actually really liked. Like I said, didn't love the writing style, didn't love the tone, didn't love the examples, but loved some of the ideas that he brought up, because I think these are really important ideas that, again, if this was a series of articles on those ideas, it would have been amazing, because he brought up a really good point about power and balance, and like this idea of how AI is inevitable, and the concept of, is AI actually a choice, or is it inevitable? And he thinks that it's not inevitable and that it is a choice, but we have to think about like who is going to be impacted by it, what type of work is it going to do? And, you kind of need to consciously make that, like we as a society need to make that conscious decision to try and implement AI in such a way that we as humans being in the loop are centaurs versus reverse centaurs, right? And I loved that idea. And I think this idea and concept of the power imbalance is so important, because between all of the news stories of developments and growth and the excitement behind AI, we don't really realize, or there's not enough discourse about the power that corporations and our bosses have over our futures. Like, it's not AI that's replacing us. It's people that are replacing other people with this promise of what they think AI can do. And we've talked about it. Yes, there are still a lot of limitations in what AI can do to actually replace us, but there are some things where it can replace us. And I think we've talked about this in the past. I think China passed this bill where you can't fire someone to replace them with an AI for their job. And it's like, I think he doesn't talk about that example, but I think the future that he's suggesting that we should be going towards is that kind of a concept, which, China really did get a W with that, because like, what a great idea. And like, that is how we preserve the human in the loop. So yeah, so that like power balance, something that I really loved about the book. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the centaur part, but yeah, the power is definitely something to consider. And that's, again, why I think this book, even though maybe it was well written, but it gets these ideas, gets us talking about it, it could spark something. And it's something to consider that, yeah, like you said, like there are all these hype men, Sam Altman is a hype man. He's trying to raise capital for his company, obviously, but you have to think of the human costs, the downstream effects of this, and us as users, it's easy to get drawn into the hype that, oh, there's so much you can do with AI. And we are, of course, we've talked about this as well, the AI backlash, right? There is kind of this general, I think, shift, especially from younger generations that are going to grow up with this, right? That they're being like, us maybe with more informed decisions, we have maybe a slightly different perspective. But the AI, I mean, we both kind of work in like education adjacent, right? Like you're seeing young folks are seeing this, AI sort of decimating the job market, whereas the business people are promoting like, oh, we're so much productive, we're making all this money. But then the real effect is like new college graduates can't find jobs because, as you said, they're going for these roles that are, they're replacing it with AI, they're consolidating positions, and they're not thinking about, like, again, I feel like we rehash this, but you're not training the next generation when these eventually retire. So who's going to run the AI even if you don't invest in the juniors, right? To build them up and give them those experiences you had as like a senior developer. Yeah. So it's a little bit short-sighted just for like corporate profits, but yeah, Doctorow he brings it up as it's a long-term effect on society.
Yeah. And like, again, that's such a good point. I don't really have anything else to add to that because I just agree with you.
Yeah.
But this is kind of like a niche random example, but there was an example that I really loved. And he brought up this example of Google and like the cycle of Google kind of forcing AI on people through its Google chatbot. Because now what Google does is anytime you search something, the first thing that you get is Gemini. And, it really kind of creates an imbalance in relationship between Google and all of the websites that allow Google to scrub it, because now Google, instead of Google taking you to people's websites, it's just giving you the answer. Anyways, he goes into a whole thing about it. But my favorite part about that analogy and that example is he talks about how Google has this partnership with Reddit. And I think about this all the time, but Google has this partnership with Reddit. Okay. And so it is using a lot of Reddit content for its answers that Gemini gives you when you search something. And so people are now like flooding Reddit, and AI bots are flooding Reddit with more content. And so obviously Google is going to keep using all this Reddit content. And for me, like I just constantly can't stop thinking about how all of these AI results, like search results, are really just majority coming from Reddit, which is such a biased space where you can flood the conversation and bias it in a certain direction. And I actually love that he brought it up, because that is something new that I feel like I haven't seen discourse on the internet. Like personally, I don't know if other people are talking about it, but I love that he brought it up. So I was like, yes, we need to talk about this like cycle of search and Google just like eating itself.
Yeah. And this relates back to our news of the week. So speaking of open weights and training, and yeah, Doctor brings this up, and just to not talk about the book specifically, but just talk about like news in general. One of these things about, country specific AI models that are trained, similar to what you brought up, Patricia, how like in AI, large language models, they're trained on user data, right? Like they're trained on literally Reddit comments. That's why sometimes the results sound like Reddit. You don't even need to go there. Like if you ask ChatGPT, it speaks in its training style, but it has this, it ties back to this open weight concept and how it can be influenced by the creators. So, I mean, I follow a lot of Chinese news, but like if you ask a Chinese made LLM, it's not going to talk bad about the Chinese government. So there is stuff in the training data that it's inherently biased, right? Like it's like we don't, and because of these closed weight models, so this is where we go for the open weight versus closed weight, we don't know for certain like what's baked into, the guardrails or anything else in like the OpenAI, ChatGPT or Claude. I mean, obviously there's like safety guardrails. You can't ask it how to make a bomb. It'll tell you, it won't give you that answer, but it'll give like bias, like because it's trained on using your Reddit example, even though I know you were talking about search results, but it had me think of how Reddit content was used to train the model in the first place, because it's like this repository of human conversations. So they use it obviously as how to sound more human. They check Reddit comments. But again, to your point, the demographic of Reddit users is predominantly white males, like white males in tech. So
Yeah.
the speech patterns are from white males in tech. And I don't think it was this book. I think it was another AI book I read where there's, I think it was The Empire of AI by Karen Howe. And she was talking about, building models what her like kind of future vision, and I'll use this as a segue to life after AI when I pass it back to you. But her idea, and it's similar here, is how her like future vision of these models was making the models more accessible and then like training it on like an indigenous people's language. So they have their own version of it that sounds like them, that thinks like them, having like country specific models that are more in line with, and of course there's a bunch of, ethical concerns as well. Like, how do you determine like what's the best like decision for a country or ethnic group? But when you put the models in the hands of small, make it more accessible, more open source, people can decide for themselves, like, oh, how do I want my LLM to react, to sound like? I want to train mine, to sound more like people I identify with. Of course, has the whole other, we could get this like that you're making an echo chamber, and that how is that better or worse? But I think that the general, like what I was saying, to bring this to home, kind of sort of going on a bunch of tangents, is the idea of the accessibility and like the distribution, equalizing equality, what we first brought up, is it's like a net benefit. And he brings up there as this is one of the benefits of like the end of it. So I think I'm like off track on my initial
No,
point of about AI models in the
actually
future, but
bring it around really well
yeah,
to how he ends, right? With like what happens after the
yeah,
AI
what happens
bubble
after the bubble?
bursts,
Yeah,
right? So one of the things he says, which I think is like a bit, but I think you kind of have to be this way to make a book like this make waves. But you're going to be a little shocking. He's like, when the AI bubble bursts, it's going to be worse than the 2008 crash. It's going to be worse than COVID. It's, he makes it kind of seem a little post-apocalyptic, the AI bubble bursting. But he does bring up that when the AI bubble does burst, which he thinks it's going to burst, what does that kind of leave us with? And he really does talk about this idea of like open source models that can be locally housed on your own personal devices, and being able to actually just start using like these statistical tools, and
yeah.
how that is actually going to change people's interaction with AI and actually make AI more accessible, which I think is kind of related to what you were saying.
Yeah, I think I just got off a little track. But yeah, it's that's like, as you mentioned earlier, like the ending was very strong. And I thought those ideas, like I think he uses a specific example of like, okay, all these data centers. If AI bubble bursts, we don't need all these data centers. We're gonna have all these extra GPUs, and then you can use those same GPUs to solve, like, I think he was talking about climate change. I think that was the example he gave, right? Like
Yeah.
that the same like mathematical modeling needed for climate change uses GPUs just like AI. So it allows us to tackle other problems. But related to what we were talking about distribution, like at the end of the last tech bubble, right? It's like so many of the next wave of the internet came out of the like ashes of Web 1.0, right? When the dot-com bubble burst, that's what led us to Google. And because if you think about, I think he mentioned this, like we have, he also talks about the labor market. Like you have all these AI data scientists that are suddenly going to be out of the job. And this mirrors the dot-com bubble when you had programmers out of the job from the 2000 like crash. They went off to start their own companies. So we have, and this time around, we don't have we do have a lot of programmers too, but we also have data scientists that are there so they can apply these same statistical ideas. Now they have maybe access to the remnants of data centers. So, one startup company buys, a couple GPUs and they go start their own thing because now they can get it cheap. They don't need to rent the data center from Amazon, and yeah, they go off. So I think he does like, yes, it was bleak a little bit on the bursting the bubble is going to be rough, but I think he does paint like a little bit like a optimistic picture that from the ashes, after we go through the transition phase, there's a a chance a historical backed example that things come out of the ashes, right?
Yeah, it's where the heroes rise. Yeah, well, I did like that ending, like you said. Like, I think that it was strong and kind of hopeful, and like a really masked sort of way, in that there will be opportunity for humans to take that rubble and turn it into something good. So it does leave you with a bit of like a bleak, optimistic hope. But first, it's like everything's going to crash, which I think is fine. Like, it is what it is. Like you said, these things happen. And then that's where innovation comes out of. I do really like that he did hone in on the statistical side of things, which I think most people don't really connect with when it comes to AI. Like, we hear things like this all the time. I'm sure you do, like, whoa, my ChatGPT knows me so well. And it's like, no, babe, it's just a set of probabilities. And so I do think that he brings that out really well. And he does mention that another thing that he thinks is, after the bubble does crash, people will connect with that a little bit more and have that understanding of the statistics and ML side of things. So it looks like there is hope, I think.
Yeah, I think it's optimistic. And as a whole, I mean, I would, to wrap this up, still give it a 5-star review. Like, that was my Goodreads review of this, because I thought it's a book that it had its message. I think it got its point across. It resonated with me as a reader. So as someone who is a little bit scatterbrained, I like my fast-paced action fantasy novels. I think it spoke to me. I read too much on the internet already, so it spoke my language. Like I said, I like the idea to circle around the Centaur itself, because I was a big fan of the idea in Co-Intelligence by Ethan Malik. I like the idea of centaurs. I never really thought about, are we turning into reverse centaurs? So it did give me something to think about, and yeah, it ends optimistically. So what would you give this, Patricia?
I gave it 2.5 reverse centaurs out of 5. Like I said, I did like the ideas, but for me, just the delivery had me so lost. I hate how long it took me to read the book. I like to just fly through books. I tried to listen to the book. I tried to read as I mentioned, I tried to listen and read at the same time. And it just felt like it took a lot of brain power for me. So yeah, didn't love the medium. Wished it was a series of articles. Really liked the ideas. And that's what kind of gives the book that extra little boost for me. But yeah, not one of my favorites. And I unfortunately would not recommend it to my friend circle, which for me is always kind of how I think of my ratings. Like, did it leave an emotional feeling for me? It just left me feeling frustrated, unfortunately. But, did love the ideas, and some stuff that I definitely will take away or some stuff I will take away. And so, yeah, those are my thoughts. Have read the book? Let us know your thoughts. Who do you agree with, me or Zac? Do you have any other thoughts that you want to add to the discussion? What should be the next book that the Everyday Data Book Club reads? Let us know. We'd love to hear from you in the comments, as always. And with that, goodbye.
Thanks for listening and watching. Bye-bye.
Bye. See you next time.
See you next time.